Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to make some comments that relate to my own personal circumstances. Earlier this year, following intense media speculation about the circumstances surrounding my purchase of an apartment on the Gold Coast in May 2015, I asked the Department of Finance to review my travel records in as much as they involved travel to, from and transiting the Gold Coast for the entire time that I had been a government minister, namely between September 2013 and January 2017. I've recently received the Department of Finance's final report, and as I indicated that I would do at the time, I am making the report publicly available at the first opportunity, that is today. To assist the Department of Finance, I provided whatever records were required or requested, way beyond what would be normal for acquittal of ministerial travel claims. In doing so, some of the information that I provided was personal and related to government processes, and for this reason, I shan't be releasing the attachments to the report as they are regarded as cabinet in confidence. However, the 15 pages of the report itself, the conclusions that were reached, I shall be tabling today. The department found that over a 3.5-year period there had been one claim that was outside entitlements. This was for a 5-minute car trip. Even so, to avoid any doubt, I had already repaid the entire amount in January this year. As I stated at the time, my unplanned purchase of a property changed the character of that trip from business to personal, and I repaid the total cost. As it drew so much attention, I would like to place on the record the circumstances around this purchase. I know that the notion of buying a property on impulse may seem quite strange to some, and while the purchase of this particular property was on impulse, the decision to purchase a property was not. I was in Queensland on ministerial business. I had an important announcement in Brisbane first thing Saturday morning, followed by a meeting with doctors and patients. I then had a meeting on the Gold Coast mid-afternoon, which was the reason I was travelling there. It also meant that in the normal course of events, I had a couple of hours where I was at a loose end. I had been considering purchasing a property for some time. In mid-2014, I'd received pre-approval from the Hume Bank in Albury for such a purchase. So on Friday night, when my attention was drawn to something suitable and when I was going to be on the Gold Coast as a matter of course, I went along to the auction. It was an entirely incidental and unplanned activity to what was an otherwise busy weekend schedule. The first time that I saw the apartment was 20 minutes before the auction commenced, and the first time that I spoke to an agent about this property was when I registered as I walked through the door. Now, there are two other matters that I would like to address. The first is the issue of the number of times I travelled to the Gold Coast. This has also been the subject of substantial media commentary and public speculation. During the 703 days I was a cabinet minister, I spent 15 nights on the Gold Coast. To put this in perspective, as both a minister and cabinet minister for some 1,100 days, I spent over half of that time, 684 days to be precise, away from my home electorate. This might seem an enormous amount of travel, but is explained by two factors. The first is that I had two very busy portfolios, health and sport, three really if you include aged care as part of the health portfolio. These portfolios have a very substantial number of constituent and interest groups with whom a minister needs to be visible. This is a massive workload. I'm not complaining, I loved it. I simply raise it as a matter of fact. The second factor is that, unlike most ministers, I represent a rural electorate. Flight schedules and connections make frequent travel more challenging. For example, while most ministers may be able to fly home Saturday afternoon and fly out to another destination Monday morning, for someone from a rural electorate, this is often simply impractical. Quite apart from the substantially longer travel time, assuming that one could get flight connections on a weekend in the first place, and the ridiculously short turnaround time when one was at their home base, there is the issue that to do so would involve considerably greater cost to the taxpayer than staying put. A minister from Melbourne or Sydney can get a 6 o'clock morning flight to Brisbane, a minister from Albury cannot. To return to the issue of my overnight stays on the Gold Coast, of these 15 overnight stays, 6 were related to me being the keynote speaker at a conference. Whether childcare, aged care or health, a moment's thought would confirm that an organisation such as the Pharmacy Guild will have more success having their annual conference over a weekend on the Gold Coast than attempting to run it at Darling Harbour midweek. Another 6 days were for major hospital openings and/or sporting events in my capacity as Minister for Health and Sport. The 2018 Commonwealth Games are being held on the Gold Coast, so it's hardly surprising that the Commonwealth Sports Minister will be required to be there from time to time in the lead-up. 2 of these 6 trips were specifically related to discussions around the 2018 Commonwealth Games. One newspaper article suggested that because a meeting to inspect sporting infrastructure went for only an hour, that was the sum total of my working day. It's a pity the person writing that article didn't seek the full facts before going to print. In fact, the day in question contained a full morning's discussion of Commonwealth Games infrastructure, a working lunch and a youth mental health visit. 2 trips involved no more than landing at Coolangatta Airport, utilising it as a hub before travelling into northern New South Wales on parliamentary business. Regardless of these facts, the public impression was cast. In politics, I understand the facts can get lost in the search for a good story. I'd like to draw attention to the section in the finance report which notes overnight stays where I didn't claim travelling allowance, and I quote, "The itinerary of a trip was shaped in part by considerations that could be categorised as personal in nature. Ms Lee had given thought to such matters at the time of submitting her claims and did not seek to be paid travelling allowance for a number of overnight stays." In revisiting this period and reflecting on the standard I set myself, I determined in the course of this review that while not required to do so, I have nonetheless chosen to make further voluntary adjustments, which together with the earlier repayments and including a 25% loading amount to just over $5,000. Most of this amount is attributable to 3 nights accommodation for business meetings in Brisbane where an overnight stay was required and I chose to stay on the Gold Coast, 2 flights to get to Canberra for parliamentary sittings that originated from Coolangatta rather than my home base, a flight back home after a business meeting in Brisbane where that meeting had been followed by personal leave, and taxi fares where I had not made a diary note and whose purpose I cannot recall, totalling approximately $200. I was within the rules in claiming reimbursement for such expenses. However, I've always believed in listening to the electorate, and one thing became clear to me: the parliamentary expenses guidelines did not align with the community standard. And when I reflected on both the community standard as well as the standard I set myself, I decided that standard had not been met. Up until now, because the rules and regulations have been unclear, members of Parliament couldn't always be 100% sure when the line of public expectation is crossed. That decision-making is set to be taken out of our hands with the announced changes to work expenses, and I think that's a good thing. I take this opportunity to comment on further allegations made against me concerning ministerial charter and my pilot's licence. I have held this licence since I was 19, and from time to time I fly a small 4-seater single-engine Cessna in my electorate. Claims suggesting I booked a ministerial charter between capital cities in order to maintain flying hours as a pilot are ridiculous. Yes, as a pilot myself, I may have sat next to the pilot on some of these charters, and sometimes I tweeted from the cockpit, perfectly legitimate. The simple fact is I'm not endorsed to fly any of the aircraft that were ever booked for ministerial travel or travel to Canberra. The thought that I might have logged flying hours on such flights is laughable. When I resigned as minister, I did so because the facts could not overcome the story. The repayments I've chosen to make entirely voluntarily are because I recognise that I have fallen short of community standards and I want to put the matter beyond further commentary. I'm releasing this report as I gave a previous commitment to make it publicly available, ahead of time, not knowing what it would contain. In no way do I seek to complain about my situation or the way events played out. I simply table the outcome of the investigation, as I said I would, and in doing so, I allow people to draw their own conclusions. I accept the mercurial world, which is politics today. Although if I could pass on an observation that I'm sure others have experienced, the front page news and associated conclusions drawn about me talk of someone who bears no resemblance to me. Even so, I have been incredibly fortunate to serve in Malcolm Turnbull's cabinet, and even more fortunate to represent the people of Farrer here in the Federal Parliament. I thank my colleagues and friends for their support, and I thank my constituents from the bottom of my heart for the faith they have shown in me.